Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Stedman podcast. Hope you are having a wonderful weekend. And Micah, boy, last week's episode was fun to record, nervous to record, but it also we got a lot of feedback from that episode.
Wow.
Yeah.
I was nervous about recording it. I'm glad we did. I'm glad we had that conversation. I feel like the church needs to have that same conversation and see where we are. And as you told me, we've had a lot of comments on
Yeah, we did. We had a lot of comments.
social and YouTube and everything.
Yeah. And actually, with over the weekend, just a quick number, over the weekend, because again, we drop our episode on Friday, so today's Monday as we record. 31 people have already listened to just the audio version. 31 people have already listened to this podcast. And this is according to Podbean. Like, sometimes they don't do good when you link it up to other things like Apple Music or Spotify, or I guess it's called Anchor now, their podcast division. So pretty good episode, a lot of stuff. So I'm going to go quick through some of the comments. So one comment we got was from our good buddy Steve Roby. He actually commented on our YouTube page and said, "Hey guys, thanks for the conversation. I enjoyed it." So that was good. The other thing that I noticed is I made a mention about the UMC and kind of the whole disaffiliation and the things that led to that. And I mentioned a friend of mine's name, Caleb, and Caleb actually listened to it and he commented on it and he kind of gave some clarification. And he said, I just had a chance to listen to this, and as someone you mentioned this episode, and you signed COG Affirm and serves at Oxford UMC right next to Miami University, I found it quite interesting. It was, I would clarify, the UMC has never officially been affirming, and when the Special General Conference of 2019 added more punitive language to how to handle LGBTQ persons, it caused quite an uproar for many, particularly in the U.S. Before 2019, the language was practicing homosexuals, but then self-affirming was added because, as you can figure, practicing isn't actually something that you can verify unless you happen to be there. While the language of the UMC certainly remains anti-LGBTQ, the traditionalists are using a paragraph added to our Book of Disciplines in 2019, even reference the page number, page 2553, to leave because in the U.S., traditionalists are in the minority compared to other places in the world. And while nothing can happen until 2024 General Conference, they fear the UMC is heading in a direction they don't like, which is to say they are leaving not because something has happened, but because they either fear it will happen or have general disdain for the UMC as it is. And I'll also add, before this comment becomes an article in itself, that as a pastor who leads a congregation of diverse perspective and beliefs on this issue, it is certainly not an easy one to navigate when you're dealing with people who have opposing viewpoints. And then he also mentioned later, P.S. I attended a Church of God camp meeting while in college, and I distinctly remember this issue being brought up, and someone said, we don't need to discuss because we already know the answer. So this reluctancy to speak on it by the Church of God is not new. It is simply their MO.
Where did you say that person was from?
He is Oxford UMC.
So right outside where I work, or
Yes.
close to where I work.
Yep, and that's actually one of my good friends from Camp Marengo, and we also went to Anderson around the same time and took a theology class with Barry Callen together.
Interesting.
Yeah, so so that's him kind of giving some insight. Couple of people I've talked to. Actually, one particular person, I thought this was an interesting conversation. Definitely not necessarily a Church of God Affirm issue, but just another Church of God issue in general. We were just getting to talking about that and some other topics like the price hike for ministers and churches, amongst other things. And one of the things that he said is he was talking to somebody, and I can't remember if this is someone who's like a higher up in the Church of God or a higher up within or a regional pastor. Can't remember what this person's position is. But my buddy, who's a minister out in Nebraska, said he was talking to this person, and the person made the comment that if the Church of God Reformation movement folded in on itself, they would be okay with it. Where
Yikes.
my friend as a pastor said, I'm
Well,
not there
well,
yet.
by folding in on itself, what do you mean, or what do they mean?
Basically means if it no longer exists, if it just completely collapses and the Church of God Reformation movement no longer exists anymore because it has completely. I don't know if it mean if what that person says, again, I don't know the full context. I don't know if that means if we have a split or if it's just simply because we keep seeing such a decline of churches in our movement. No one seems to give to Anderson, which is why we have a price hike. And not only, well, at least half of them are still giving out of the
I was gonna
2,000 that
I was gonna say you said the M word, movement.
movement. Oh, I'm sorry, denomination. Um, and that there seems to be, and I think this is kind of interesting too, that even though we are a movement and we don't have like we don't have like a book of creeds or anything else, it's just the Bible, then it's almost like, at least from my friend's point of view, it almost seems like the position of the general director in some ways is kind of a joke. Because if you're the general director and you're supposed to be kind of the Pope of the Church of God, and you say whatever, it's every single church can basically say, well, we don't have to listen to that. We can just kind of do our own thing. And really, there's no big like hard rule or statute saying, okay, this is what we believe, so everyone must follow suit. It's almost kind of like, well, we're a movement. We are not configured to these policies or these whatever. It's just simply the Bible. So if I read the Bible and I read it different than the general director, interpret it than the general director, then I don't have to listen to what the general director has to say. So just a couple of interesting comments that came from those conversations, and even just some comments. And there's some people who are hoping that, the way we navigate this issue, we do it with we do it very smoothly and we don't kind of butcher it. So, which I feel like that's going to be kind of a hard thing because it is such a very
Hot button topic.
hot button topic that has to be addressed. What about you, Micah? Any comments from you or anything you've been seeing since the podcast?
So a couple of things. I had my wife listen to it. We usually listen to the show back just to see, how I'm improving or the conversation, especially if the topic's, considerably considered a hot button topic, like we just said. You know, one of the things I kept saying to friends and pastors and leaders, that I have been in different circles with over the last couple of weeks has been, we shouldn't be shocked that this conversation hasn't happened sooner.
Yeah.
And to your friend from Oxford, thank you for that comment. I want to continue to be educated and I want to continue to learn. And my stance, or not my stance, I'm sorry, my thought, I have a couple of friends that are pastors in UMC churches, and I've led worship in those spaces and helped with sound and live stream consulting and things like that. And you walk in the church and it's like, wow, there's pride flags here and pride flags there, and you would just think that the UMC is full blown affirming of LGBTQ. But to your friend's point, I didn't know that, what he said, as far as the whole, it has to come back up at the conference. Is that you're considered like your national conference kind of thing?
Kind of. It's weird because there's each district has their conference. So West Ohio has their conference, but then the big general conference, that's the one that is the whole entire UMC. So it would almost be like GA, like we just had our West Ohio conference this past weekend. So that's like our Ohio GA. And then every 4 years they do a big national conference, and that would be kind of like our camp meeting or our
Hmm.
general assembly, the Anderson General Assembly. Yeah.
So yeah, I appreciate being educated more on that. And the other thing that I've had conversations with people, different generations, different areas of the country, um, is that we're going to jump into this next week. By the way, for our listeners, like Jim Lyon, Church of God Ministries announced, I think it was Friday. Scott, I sent it to you,
Friday. Yeah.
or you sent it to me. I don't remember who did what, but like he's apparently going to jump on a live stream this coming Friday, June 9th from 1 to 2:30. So if you're a pastor, a leader in the Church of God, please jump on that and
Yeah.
give it a listen, see what he has to say. But like one of the trends that I'm seeing with friends and family and pastors and leaders in churches has been, why is this taking so long for there to be a response? Why are we taking 2 weeks to respond to this? It was one thing that they waited till 5 o'clock on a Friday on a holiday weekend to do a very vague social media post. But like, it's almost like you're just letting this thing catch fire by letting it go on for almost 3 weeks and then doing a Facebook Live to respond to it to see where the Church of God is, when it shouldn't take that long.
Well, and kind of going back to the point we made last week, if they didn't even post anything Friday, I'm sure 90% of the people probably wouldn't even know what this was going on.
Right. And so that's the other thing. It's like it's almost like the other person that made the comment about the Church of God imploding on itself. Like, what if this is the proverbial nail to the coffin, and people are too vague to, too naive to see the writing on the wall. And it's, we've done other episodes on church health and things like that, and that's a separate topic. But like, some churches aren't going to be strong enough to survive this, let alone some other things that may come up. And it's very, it makes my heart hurt. And I want to say that it's not for the reasons people think that it makes my heart hurt. It makes my heart hurt that we're not willing to have a conversation with folks, and we're not willing to see where people are. And it's this whole drawing lines in the sand, and it's this, generational uh generational problem that we've had in the Church of God for decades. And it's like, throw the LGBTQ conversation out the window for a second. It's church health, it's church leadership, it's other topics, racial diversity, LGBTQ plus, alcoholism, sex trafficking, pornography, drugs. Like, there are manipulative, narcissistic people in your church that are serving on your elder boards. There are so many issues, and that kind of all revolves around church health. And I think that we're just missing the mark, and it's very disheartening. And so I don't understand why it takes almost 3 weeks for somebody to have a conversation and to jump on it live. And like, I don't know what to expect. Scott, you said you don't know what to expect. I'm sure that the majority of folks in the country, all around the country, are brothers and sisters who are pastors and leaders of Church of God churches all over the place. I don't know what they're thinking either. But something that I said last week, like, you've got some pretty passionate people one way or the other, and that always makes for a disaster. And even reading some of the comments on social media and the threads of, okay, the Church of God made the announcement, hey, we're gonna have this Facebook Live and we're going to address this thing. That's already caught fire. There's like 400 comments on one.
Yeah. Oh, and I was even going to bring up a good point with that too, because even that's the thing. Because even when and I think that's also depends on kind of where people are at. You know what I mean? I think when Pastors Fellowship posted their kind of response in regards to human sexuality, I think a majority of the stuff I was seeing, just comments from that post, was like, amen, amen, amen. Like, very like, praise God, amen. Very well, something, it's not surprising from, the target audience that Pastors Fellowship seems to have.
But then you have somebody like the state pastor in Indiana who wrote an outstanding response, scripture, theology, backed up all his points. Like, if that was an exegetical paper in a New Testament class or whatever, it would have been an A++, right? And I was very thankful for that. And I think they did. I think Florida did.
So I didn't see Florida. Like the only stuff I posted, like with my post for the podcast, was kind of a clarification that I had from my pastor about the UMC regarding LGBTQ affirmation within the UMC, Pastors Fellowship response, and Indiana Ministries response. So I didn't get to see any other state. Did Ohio Ministries post a response?
Nope.
I didn't think so.
Jordan told me that they were supposed to come out with something on Friday and they never did.
Probably because they saw Anderson was going to put something. So like, well, if Anderson's doing it, we're just going to back away from the table and let them take it.
But back to my point about leadership, like if it's coming from the top, then why did it take so long for them to respond? And then like you have like these state pastors that are, just like, we're going to take a stand. If our leadership can't, our state's going to represent our state.
And then not only that, but even like when the Church of God finally said, hey, we're going to do a special announcement and we're going to discuss it, like, over 400 comments, and my goodness.
From like one side or the other, right? Like like my favorite was I saw one that said, I've been Church of God my whole life, now I'm Baptist, or something like that. I don't remember. Something similar to that.
Well, even just fighting, but then even like some of the comments, which I think some of the few comments from some of my close friends has been, I find it discouraging that we have pastors who were supposed to, speak the truth in love and love the sinner, but hate the sin. And yet a topic like this, we're getting to the point where we're being very passive aggressive, very mean, very confrontational, and not being very loving and having a dialogue, which I think it's okay. And I think there's one thing, there's a person on here who I know because we went to Anderson together, and he was in my social club, and he gives a story about, kind of him being part of the LGBTQ community, but he brings out that, you have to remember that it's not just a topic you're discussing, but you're discussing people. You're discussing human beings, part of this community, and how the church is going to respond to them. And I think, there's obviously with any type of church, well, let me say this. With any type of denomination, you're going to have to deal with policies and statements of faith and what we believe, so that people who want to be a part of your denomination can say, okay, I want to be a part of this. If we're going to say the word movement, then that's going to be different, because movement's not about policy and procedures and mission statements. A movement is about a group of people who are doing their best to try to follow and live out their faith in Jesus Christ and do it authentically and faithfully. And I think that's where, the movement denomination debate, which we're not going to talk about that today, but I think that's where we're going to kind of get to a head. If we're a movement, there's some great things that come from being a movement, but there's some weaknesses about being a movement, where there's a lot of strengths about becoming a denomination, but then there's also a lot of weaknesses too. So you're going to have to kind of figure out, like Jeanette Flynn said when we interviewed her, the Church of God has to figure out who we are and what we believe.
It's taken a really long time to figure that out. And some would argue that denomination or non-denomination, denomination and movement are the same thing. We're just calling it something different. And then that's the compromise. But when I was raised as a kid, we were always told that we were Church of God Anderson, but we were non-denominational.
Mm-hmm.
It's not non-denominational because other Church of Gods have the same beliefs that we do.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's what we're going to stow again. Friday, like Micah said, Friday from 1 to 2, Facebook Live. I don't know if it's going to be on their YouTube channel. I think it's just Facebook Live. But General Director Jim Lyons is going to speak on this issue of human sexuality, Church of God Affirm, and everything. So we'll see. We'll see kind of what he says and the response, and kind of, I guess we'll get back on next time and really discuss that topic. So with that being said, let's kind of shift gears and go to Stories Gone Wild. Micah, do you have a Stories Gone Wild for us today?
Not necessarily stories gone wild, but like we walked into church yesterday and I've shared that this Presbyterian church is been great, a great place to go to, and we um have had a lot of fun going, getting to know these people, getting to love on them, get them, to love on us. And it's just been my joy and my honor to be there. It's different than what we're used to because it's like we joked with the pastor that it's kind of like Catholic light, meaning that they have a lot of liturgy, they have a lot of prayers, they have a lot of um, their order of service is very rote, and it's very like every week is the same. Which is what it really means. But like, somebody gets up, they do the announcements, they do a call to worship, they do song one, they do a thing called Passing the Peace of Christ, which is basically just, a meet and greet time. You can either shake hands, wave people, throw the peace sign up, as I like to do. Um, People laugh when I do that. And then, they jump into worship songs 2 and 3, and then they have a prayer of confession, and then like an assurance of pardon.
Mm-hmm.
And then they do 2 more songs: community prayer, the Lord's Prayer, doxology, the message, and then they do kind of like a prayer at the end, and they do a song, and then they do a benediction, and they're out. So a couple of weeks ago I was talking to somebody at the church, and they were talking, they came up to me afterwards, and they knew who I am, and they knew that I'm a worship leader, and they were asking my opinion about some stuff. And one of the things I said was, I've worked in churches where we've had, contemporary services and traditional services, and we've had blended services and contemporary services. And I kind of got to the point where, it was exhausting to ask your volunteers to do multiple services and learn different music and for different services. And so some people would serve in both, and it's just a big ask, right? And so we got into the conversation about contemporary versus traditional worship music. And I thought it was hysterical. But this church is primarily older, and they asked, the guy was talking to me about, don't say the word contemporary. And I was like, what do you mean? He was like, people would react poorly if you said the word contemporary or said that you're going to move to more contemporary style or contemporary service. However, if you get up and said, hey, we're going to introduce a new song today, and just play the song or introduce a new song to the congregation, they're fine with it. But what I found interesting was that since we've been going there for the last couple of months, they'll do 2 or 3 songs a week that are contemporary. This week they did This Is Amazing Grace by Phil Wickham. I mean, that song's, almost 10 years old, but it's more contemporary. Yeah. It's got a more blended vibe to it. A couple of weeks ago, they did like Hymn of Heaven by Phil Wickham. And they've done Waymaker, and they've done Living Hope, and they've done Goodness of God, and they've done all these songs, but like people just don't call them contemporary. But they love them, and they sing them very loudly. And it's like, why, is that a good approach? And I know that we're going to jump into staffing here in a minute, but like if you hire a new worship leader and you're like asking them to do a more blended service, is it a better idea just to say, good morning, let's stand together and worship, we're going to sing a new song together today, and not call it contemporary or traditional? Or we're going to sing this great hymn of the faith, and take your hymnals out and turn to page 422. I have never thought of that in over 10 years of worship ministry.
I think now that's kind of I think it goes back to something that Gloria Gaither said years ago when I was at Anderson, and she was talking about worship wars, which I know we've talked about that topic quite a bit. And she just kind of talked a little bit about, the stuff that her and Bill went through when they were doing gospel music, and, doing gospel music when everything was very traditional and hymn driven. And So, and she kind of even made the comment, like, it's funny, it's weird seeing, Gaither songs in the Church of God hymnal, because back when they were starting and doing their music ministry, that would not have been something that they would have imagined would have happened due to kind of but she made the comment, kind of the alluding to, worship is just a way for us to respond to God. So who cares about whether it's contemporary or traditional? It's about surrender, which I thought was really good point that she made. And I think in all of that, going back to your question about, should we even say this is a contemporary worship position or this is a traditional position? Like, I would say that's something that I think we're at a point now that those contemporary, modern, just putting a label on worship is sometimes can be so divisive. Just saying, hey, we're here to have worship and we're going to play a new song, or even not even a new song, but hey, we're going to play a song that I think that some of us may not be familiar with, but I think it's going to be a great song that really fits with Pastor so-and-so's theme. And I think it's a great song for us to really usher us into the presence of God for worship. And you just kind of, then it doesn't matter if it's a four bar stanza or whatever, it's worship. And it doesn't matter if it's traditional or contemporary, because it is just simply a time of worship.
Well, and I think too that like this whole idea of contemporary versus, traditional, you brought up a great word in surrender. And I think that we so many times get lost in we get lost so many times in the idea that we're not there for ourselves. We're there for an audience of one, whether we're serving, whether we're on staff, whether we're a layperson in the audience. We get lost in God's presence, and that's why we're there, and that's why we're supposed to be there. And it shouldn't matter the song. And yeah, I could talk all day about that, but yeah, it's a powerful thing when you see the Lord, and just as Isaiah did, just as Ezekiel did, just as Elijah did. All these people they just get caught up in God's presence, these biblical figures, and I've experienced the Holy Spirit before, and it's just one of the most anointed times. And full transparency, kind of circle back a little bit to the COG Affirm thing. We were in there, and they sang "This Is Amazing Grace" as that first song yesterday, and yeah, it was different, and yeah, it was not really what I'm used to, but Pastor Jason got up there and he said a prayer right after that first song, and he talked about God's amazing grace, and tears just rolled down my face, and my wife's like, "Are you okay?" And I was like, it just breaks my heart that the Church of God is going through some of this stuff. And it breaks my heart even more that we're taking so long to deal with it. And I'm not saying, hey, we just need to nail this in the butt. I'm saying we need to have difficult conversations and have, like you said earlier, dialogue. And yeah, it's heartbreaking.
Yeah, I hear you, man. Yeah.
This podcast has been all over the place.
It has been. It's been. There's a lot of emotions, from our last podcast to kind of, maybe excitement or gloom, depending on how we're approaching Friday and how that's going to go down. But yeah, I think it's just, we have to. Yeah, we just have to.
We have to be better.
We have to be better, but I think we also have to be more, and this is probably going to be taken out of context, so I'm going to clarify. I'm going to say we have to be more open-minded, but by open-minded, I mean more of, we got to be able to kind of get out of our own heads and get in get rid of our own blinders to really say, okay, how can I have an authentic, meaningful conversation so that transformation can happen on whatever the topic may be, so that I can understand those who have a difference of opinion than me and not come in with my own, and that they, when I have come in with my concerns or my rebuttal, that they're able to have those open-minded conversations too, and that we can have that healthy dialogue. And part of me thinks that with the rise of social media, and it's so easy to just say what you want because you don't have to look at the face of the person you're talking to. All you see is a little avatar or a picture or a static picture, that if I was to say some of the things that maybe I believed on a certain topic and it may have hurt or offended somebody, like deep down to the core, if I'm able to see their body reaction, I think I may be a little bit different in how I would respond, or maybe I'll be a little bit more graceful with my speech, even if I may say something that is the total opposite of what this other person believes. But I think we've gotten such in a habit that we can say what we want without consequence and not realize that, we may be saying things to help move the movement forward or to stay true to our heritage roots or whatever dialogue you want to use, but you forget that you're causing a wake of hurtfulness in the way wherever you are on this topic. Micah, you made the comment that we're going to be talking about church staffing, and of course my story's gone wild has to do with church staffing. So again, talking to a bunch of friends after our episode dropped, been on the phone with some people, and heard this story about one of my pastor buddies who their church secretary was retiring after being there for a good number of years. So they're now looking for a new secretary. So they did a whole search thing. They kind of put together of what they were looking for. They're looking for someone who kind of had the same skill set as the previous church secretary, but even looking something that has more of a knowledge of social media, which, a lot of older secretaries probably don't have a good grasp on social media marketing and sponsor posts and all that information. Go through this process, find somebody. And the pastor was very clear that, even though we found someone, we're not going to mention who it is. Even during one of their staff meetings, one of their elders said, "Oh, hey, are we going to hire this person?" And the pastor's like, "Again, we are not saying anything until they have accepted the position, they have signed their contract, and everything else. And then we'll make a huge announcement to the church so everybody knows who the new secretary is." That was just kind of how they did things, which I guess in some ways was a good thing on their part, because after a training session with this new person, the old secretary finally left, had a big celebration, a big party. And then the next day, the new person starts, and it just happened to be a day where a lot of staff was out of the office that day. This new person gets there, works from 9. Next thing you know, it's 2:00. Someone goes to one of the couple staff who are there, go to check on her. Not there. And found out later from the pastor that this person had just quit after barely a day into the new position, had quit. And I think there's a lot of, I don't know all the details, but it was just one of those things where it's like, oh, okay. So after that, but thankfully the pastor didn't immediately started calling all the people who have applied for the position saying, "Oh, sorry, you're done," whatever. Or, ghost them, because I know that's a kind of a tactic that some people use too. You don't get a call back, that probably means you didn't get it. But no, the pastor was already had a number 2 and a number 3 in case number 1 didn't work out. So their new number 2 secretary is going to start working sometime midweek this week, which I thought was just so fascinating, that didn't even say a word, didn't even contact anyone, just, "Yeah, I'm going to quit," just gets up and leaves. Which I don't think, I've been a pastor of small churches, so I don't think I've ever had that sort of thing happen because I'm the only staff. So mostly everything else is volunteer driven, but even the camp or when I was doing internships at churches, never have I seen anyone who just simply said, you know what? Yeah, it'd be weird, like, church staff or camp staff, and then all of a sudden it's like, oh, where's Jim at? Where did Jim disappear to? I don't know. Jim got in his car, left. Maybe he went to go get some snacks, or maybe he had to go run an errand. Next thing you know, Jim doesn't come back. He's completely gone to say word to anybody.
Somebody told me once, a friend of mine used to work in human resources, and I'm not even going to say the place, but he said that they had a lot of turnover in this turnover in this office, right? And so human resources is a hard place to work no matter where you are. And he told me that somebody came in, they started their first day, they left for lunch, and then didn't come back. So they didn't even make it a whole day.
Wow.
So, not to outdo your story, but like I remember that from this is a couple of years ago. They started, they came in, they worked, went to lunch, didn't come back. So what are we talking about today? After all that,
well, we're talking about church staffing, and more specifically, just kind of because we talked about all the crazy stuff that happens in church staffing, but how does one navigate church staffing? Because I feel like a lot of times when you work at a church, there's a certain
expectation,
culture, or a certain expectation when you're working at a church. And I think a lot of times the culture of a church kind of dictates how staffing happens. So you may have a church where literally maybe you hire a second, let's just use secretary as an example from kind of my case. You may have a secretary, and the churches, and according to their job description, they're supposed to do posts on social media, create and send out newsletters, get bulletin printed, maybe get sheet music printed for the musicians. Like, there may be a certain thing that they are responsible, answer phones, let people in the door, especially if you have like a locking security system, all those things. And that's kind of your job position. And then, whatever the pastor needs, you kind of do any administrative things that the pastor may need you to do. And that may be all you have to do. And then you might have some where a church member may walk in and say, hey, I'm here for a gathering. Can you make me copies of this? And it's just someone off the street asking you to do something. And it's like, well, do I do that, or do I say no? Because, or maybe you have a church where everybody has ownership of the church administration. So it's the youth pastor and the children's pastor and the lead pastor and the worship leader and just random, the head of the ushers. Everybody's like always asking for something for the administrator. So now it just seems like the stack keeps getting higher on this person's shoulders. So when it comes to hiring and maybe having a longevity of church staff, I think there's a couple things that churches can take from the business world, some lessons they can take from the business world that can make them more effective. And I think there's some other benefits that being a church you have that can kind of help with longevity in a church staff position. And again, when I say church staff, not necessarily talking about pastoral, because I know that has its whole other system on how that's done. But this is just simply a pastor, a lead pastor, or a team of people, what might be an elder board, are hiring a secretary, a janitor, maybe a children's pastor, or even an intern or a youth pastor, like those sort of things, that they have a different hiring procedure than the lead pastor. So, Micah, since you've had more experience working in churches that have more than one staff, what have you seen that has worked, and what have you seen that has kind of been like, yeah, this needs to change because this is not good?
Where to begin? So a number of things. in my own experience, it's been different in every church I've pastored. The hiring process, for pastoral staff, the hiring process for um, administrative staff, etc., um, and lead pastor. So, like, I think you nailed it, Scott, when you said, the hiring of a lead pastor is going to be completely different than associate staff, and associate staff is going to be completely different from administrative staff. Meaning, if you have office managers, um, social media marketing person, um, somebody who does finances, those are all different areas that would be under kind of the administrative umbrella. And then you have uh, associate staff, children's minister, worship minister, uh, executive pastor, associate pastor, um, senior adult pastor. All of those would fall under the associate, and then you have the lead. Um,
Mm-hmm.
in my case, I think, well, it's been done in numerous ways. So in some cases, if you're, let's just go the associate route since I have more experience in that world. Um,
Okay.
when I went to be the worshiping young adults pastor at Heber Heights Church 10 years ago, um, I met with the worship team. I came up on a random Saturday and led worship with the worship team and met the pastor and some of the staff, just kind of like, you know, non-formal meeting, but I had interest in the job. And so I met the pastor, I met the associate pastor, and met their worship team and got to hang out with them, lead worship, and just have a really nice time of worship with them. And then just wanted to see how it went, see how it felt. And the pastor reached back out to me and asked me how I felt about things, and then if I wanted to move forward. And then we from there met. They had a board of elders and a church council, two separate boards, smaller church, 200 to 300 people. I'm like, why do we have, me just thinking logically, why do we have two boards essentially?
Mm-hmm.
The church council handled certain things, and then the board of trustees handled others, which is basically how they broke that down. So then
Okay.
I met with their church council, expressed the calling of my life, and then they voted whether or not they wanted me to have a tryout, which we've talked about that before. Um, went in, uh, practiced with the band on Saturday morning, and then I had like a meet and greet with some of the church, like informally on Saturday afternoon. It was kind of like a social kind of thing. And then Sunday morning, I led worship. They voted, and then they offered me the job. I've also
Mm.
been in spaces where the lead pastor makes those decisions, and they don't even include the board. Like he or she can bring names to the board, resumes to the board, and say, "This is who I'm thinking about hiring." Great. Um, but in reference to uh, other churches I've worked at, one church, I met with the senior pastor, and he was like, "We want you to come on staff. Here's the job description. Here's how much we want you to work. Here's how much we're going to pay you. Are you interested?" And I said
Mm.
yes, and we moved forward. Had no interaction with other staff. Had no interaction with the board. Just here's the job. I've been working, not formally, but just been serving there for a while and got plugged in. Um, as far as administrative staff, uh, the kind of the same deal. The senior pastor in most situations where I've been has had um, the opportunity to hire whoever based on resumes, based on education, based on experience. Put an ad out there, whether it's in Facebook, uh, website, other avenues to get people, LinkedIn, other areas where you can get the word out that you're hiring somebody, and then you interview somebody, and you just offer them the job, and it's not as stringent of a process as, say, I just mentioned earlier when I went to Heber Heights.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, lead pastor roles, from my experience, I've not really other than like growing up in a pastor's home and my dad going through, what's called a candidating weekend where they get your resume and
Mm-hmm.
you come in, you meet the church, meet the elders, preach, they vote, they call you back a week later to let you know whether or not, they want you to come. And
Or they
Scott,
ghost you.
or they
You don't
ghost
hear
you.
anything back.
And Scott, you could probably speak more into that than I could, but like,
Yeah.
I think like from the professional world, like you said, the business world, sometimes it's a lot quicker of a turnaround than, what ministry life is like. It's, you know, some churches go several years without a senior pastor, or a year, or 18 months,
Mm-hmm.
or, 9 months. Like they go a pretty long time without filling that role, partially because they don't know what they want, or they do know what they want and they can't find that person.
Yeah.
So
And so I think I think that's the thing too, because like when you think about a lead pastor, and both from the times I was an interim and I was helping churches try to find pastors versus me trying to find a lead pastor position, it is a long process. And again, if it's an appointed system like what the UMC has,
yeah, I didn't even mention that. That's a whole different.
like that's a whole different system. It's basically, it's almost kind of in some ways, I think some people would say it's better from a pastoral side, because at least when you're leaving a church, whether you decide it's time for me to no longer pastor, let's have someone else pastor this church that can kind of do something different that may help them, because I'm at a point where I'm just kind of burned out, or just feel like not effective anymore, or I've done all that I can do with the knowledge and I've helped this church get to this point in the journey, and now someone else needs to kind of take the baton and take it to the next leg of this journey. At the same time, the church doesn't really get a choice in who is overseeing them. And I've heard stories from people who are part of churches that do appointed systems where the bishop had put the wrong pastor at the wrong church, because it wasn't a good fit. And it had caused it has kind of basically caused a lot more issues than if there would have been more of a, okay, let's just double check and make sure that this is going to be a good fit for this type of congregation. And I think even with an appointed system, even from the back end, like, the community, the culture of the church, if you're the bishop. So you kind of know, okay, here's the skill set of this person. Here's the vacancy that this congregation has. Here's the skill set of this pastor that would really help them exceed in where they're lacking. And I think that's kind of the benefit of an appointed thing. But yeah, on the other side, if it's a call system, then basically you have a search committee who is putting together a certain thing. It could be educational. We want someone with a master's degree. It could be years of experience. We want someone who has at least 5 or 10 years experience. It can be whatever it may be. It could even be specifically like, we want a male pastor. Like, it can be as detailed or vague. And then you get a bunch of resumes, you go through them, you have conversations. And I think in some ways, depending on how strong your search committee is, depends on, who you get. I know one church I was interning at, there was a pastor who was interested in this bivocational pastor at this really small church in Windham, Ohio, all the way out from Oklahoma with 7 kids. And during the interview, things are going great. And then this person demanded that this church pay him a certain salary.
Yeah, that probably went over well.
But here's the thing: this small church was asking me if that was something that they could do, and I'm thinking, do you have that money in the bank account? No. Well, then no. At the same time, it's your church. You dictate the salary that you can pay somebody. And I don't care if this guy was the smoothest talker in the world. he would be a great fit, even though he had 7 young children. And that would be a really great thing to kind of say, hey, we have kids in our church, because, and that can maybe be a launch pad of trying to get more kids in the church. There may have been a lot of perks with that person, but if you cannot pay the salary that they're asking for, then it's a no-go. Because then what's going to happen? You go and you say, okay, we're going to pay you $70,000 a year. And then this person comes in here, and after a month or two, you're basically trying to figure out, okay, we have no money to pay this person. Are you guys going to take out is the church going to mortgage their homes to pay this guy? We're going to mortgage the church, or we're going to get a loan from the bank? We're gonna beg Ohio Ministries. We're gonna beg Anderson, Indiana, for money to keep this person. Like, that's not good. So it's a lot more complicated when you're hiring to lead, because really a lot of churches, whoever your lead pastor is, that lead pastor is usually the sole person. In most cases, is the sole person who's responsible for hiring any other staff. And a lot of times, it doesn't go through a committee like the lead pastor goes through.
Mm-hmm.
So if a pastor wants to hire a youth pastor, put the word out, get the resumes, interviews, and then maybe at one point they may have like the trustees or the elder board talk with them. And then after that, depending on the feedback they get from them, could also determine, if this pastor is going to hire him or not. Or the pastor could say, okay, I've heard your feedback. I'm still going to hire this person anyway because I think they're a good fit. Like, lead pastor has all the power to do that. And I think in some ways that's okay, because in a business world, usually you have background checks, you have all this stuff that happens before you hire somebody. And then there's also certain rules, like there's a certain grace period. So if you get there and you don't want it, okay, bye. We still have a couple other people lined up for your position. Where you may not have that within a church, so they operate differently. But I think the other thing that's pretty cool, the challenging is what's going to stop a pastor from hiring a bunch of yes people to surround that pastor, so that anytime when there's any concerns about the lead pastor's leadership, well, now you have lead pastor's buddies surrounding them. And it's like, well, if the lead pastor goes, then we all walk. And now you have a complete vacuum and a big hole in the church to fill. So sometimes it can become a little bit of a power struggle if you have a pastor who's just hiring people, not necessarily they're skilled, but, well, this is my buddy, and this is my other buddy, and this is my other buddy. So it becomes like a sorority house or a fraternity, I guess.
I will say too that, like, so two things. One, I've also had the experience where I walked into a ministry situation and I never even talked to the lead pastor because it was a bigger church. I interviewed with other members of the staff and who I would be reporting to directly. And I had 2 interviews and they checked references, and I didn't even meet the lead pastor until I started.
Wow.
So it's completely different in larger ministry situations, like you mentioned earlier, Scott. The other thing, working in higher ed at a bigger institution like Miami, where I work, the hiring process is just is a bear. And I know there's state laws that go, you could probably talk to Laura about this, but like there's state laws that go into effect when you try to do any sort of hiring in higher education or K-12 education, because, there's, like you said, there's background checks. The interview process is just a small piece of the pie, right? Really, if you're looking at it, you apply for a job, you get, interviews, and then, once you get the interview and then like the person decides, hey, we're going to hire this person, it may be a month before you get your offer letter because of, the logistics of hiring. And like I said, state laws before, but the, back to ministry, like it's, for me, we live in this instant gratification world, and I'm like, why does this have to take so long? It's either you like the person or you don't. You should hire them or not. Um, but I think the church, over the years has been so picky and spoiled in reference to, well, we want this person and we want this person to have a PhD and we want, uh, you know, uh, my favorite thing at Miami, Scott, is when you look at a job description. Well, we want this position plus 5 years experience, but you have to have a master's degree in this, but you don't have that experience. You can't have that experience because you're not out of grad school yet or whatever it may be, in reference to the case. Like, you can't have the experience because you've not been able to work that job because you set the bar so high. And I get that in the church, that you want to have that person have a high level of intelligence, a great deal of leadership. And it's hard. It's almost unrealistic. Would you agree with that at times? It's almost unrealistic. Like, we want our lead pastor to have a PhD. We want that person to have 20 years experience, and we want them to be young and have a family.
Yeah.
You can't have like 30 years experience, 20 years experience, be young, have a family, and have a PhD. Like,
It'd
all those
like,
things.
We want someone in their the mid-20s, but we want them to have a PhD. And it's like, I didn't start college at like
they
4
never
years
left
old.
school. Like, they graduated high school, went to
Which is funny because they want all these accolades, these academic accolades. But to do that, you have to remember that they probably went from college to get their master's to get their doctorate.
Yeah.
And if they did all that step, what real world ministry experience have they had?
Probably none.
Well, which is why Ashland, like, to be part of the Ashland's doctorate program, you have to at least have 10 years of ministry experience. Because again, if the whole point of having a doctorate is that you have something that you see a challenge or an issue within the church, whether that's within your denomination or at the church at large.
There's that word again.
I know, denomination. We say the dirty D word in here.
Subliminal messaging.
Oh gosh. But anyway, I lost my train of thought now. But
Ashland, 10 years of experience.
Ashland, 10 years experience, because their whole thing is they want to make sure that you are actually doing ministry. So that way, after you've done ministry for 10 years, you can say, okay, here's the problems I'm seeing within the church. Here's the problems that I'm seeing within Christianity. So here's how I'm going to address it. And now I'm going to do this big, dissertation to kind of help raise awareness or issues about this topic, and then have a defense where you talk about it with people. And if you're able to pass your defense, then you get to wear the funny hat and the little like felt things on your sleeves, like the little badges of honor on your sleeves. And I'm sure some academics are going to listen to this and they're going to groan with me just saying that, like my bat wings and my master's gown. What are these bat wings?
Bat wings.
And then people say, I'm going to put snacks inside them. That's how I sneak movie theaters. That's how I go. Every time I go to movies, I wear my master's cloak, so then that way I can put like sneak food in those little bat wings. I have to pay the high prices. Anyway, hiring. So,
well, yeah. I also want to say quickly too that, like,
yeah,
in over a decade of experience of creative arts ministry, worship ministry, whether it's internships, being on staff at churches, consulting, independent contracting, whatever it may be, I'm amazed at the amount of things, quote, experience that I've had to learn on the fly over that decade, right? I didn't learn ProPresenter until I started messing with it. I didn't know how to do live streaming stuff until I started messing with it, and cameras and lighting and software and stuff, audio engineering. I didn't go to school for any of that. Like, I have went to school for music as an undergrad, but that was music performance and focused areas like percussion and piano, where I was taking lessons and performing on a regular basis with orchestras and that had nothing to do with the audio engineering side of things, or live streaming, or presenter, or the creative art side of pastoral ministry. And even in seminary, to take it a step further, I went to seminary not expecting to learn any of those things.
Yeah.
However, I didn't get taught any of those things. You don't take a class on presenter. You don't take a class on Facebook Live or YouTube Live or whatever it may be. It's all experience and learning on the fly. And people set the expectations way too high and unrealistic for jobs in the church.
Yeah. So I think when it comes to, I think like some practical good things, what churches need to look for or do when it comes to hiring staff. I think the first thing is really have a clear vision of what you need and what you want, but also have a clear vision for growth too in this position. Because you could say, my buddy, we had a secretary for 30 some years, did a great job. We are hiring someone new. We want them to be able to do the same thing that this person does. But the one thing that our previous secretary lacked was social media and doing social media. So let's try to find someone who has these same kind of skill sets, but has more of a social media, but has a good history of doing social media. I think the other thing that churches do is they're very discriminatory in their hiring. Okay. And what I mean by that is, well, we didn't hire this 40-year-old pastor to be our youth pastor because he's too old. And they'll say that. And like people will say that, well, we want someone a little bit more younger for the position. So that's why we didn't hire you. And I mean, it's a slap in the face to the person who's been doing this for so many years and probably has a lot more experience, and especially if they're constantly going to conferences and keeping up to date with the challenges that teens are going through. I think that's a good thing. At the same time, if you say, well, in a workplace, if you were to say, well, we didn't hire you because you're too old or you're too young, and you explicitly say that, that's a lawsuit waiting to happen in the business world. Churches seem to get by with it. So I think it might be good practice that if you're going to hire someone, hire them for their skill set. And if it is something where it's like, well, we do want someone younger, don't tell people that. Don't say we didn't hire you because you're not young enough or you're not educated enough, or, we didn't hire you because the way you preach, you don't preach expository or a 3-tier method. You have a whole different style of preaching that we don't like that sort of thing. You have to be very tricky with, you want to be professional with not only who you hire, but for the people you don't hire and how you communicate that to them. You need to be very professional. And then I think the last thing that I would do is don't rush. You have to have a healthy balance of not to rush someone into a position, but at the same time, don't wait so long too. If you're like Micah, your example, if you want someone who's 25 years experience and a PhD, and you put that out there and you get 2 resumes and you don't like the 2 people's resumes that you got, don't just sit there and just wait for them to come to you, or maybe keep putting it out on different websites that you want 25 years and a PhD. You may have to think, okay, is 25 years and a PhD, is that really realistic for this position? Or can we kind of note, can we have a PhD? Do we still want the PhD? If not, is a master's good enough? Or maybe a master's, and maybe, because I mean, at this point, if someone has their master's in something, they're pretty top tier as far as education. I feel like a doctorate would be like beyond that. So, I think you need to kind of think about, okay, I mean, and that was something that my family's church did. They were looking for someone with their big thing was they wanted someone with so many years of experience and a master's degree. They got a handful of resumes. Eventually, they ended up hiring somebody who didn't even have a master's degree. but had, over 30 years of experience in ministry. And I think that in itself was probably a good choice because of where they were at as a church. And, I think that was good, but they were able to pivot and say, okay, this is what we said we wanted. We're not seeing the results of what we want from, character or kind of where we see the church, the direction the church, division for the church or anything else. So maybe we might want to adjust and see. So maybe the whole master's thing, maybe we need to no longer have that be a filter anymore and kind of back it down to maybe a bachelor's or whatever. So, be flexible with your, I guess, with your limitations on who you want to hire, with your filter.
I keep hopping back and forth from higher education to ministry, but like, I have experience in both fields. Great example of that. So at Miami, where I work, an academic advisor position, minimum qualification is a master's degree in education with experience. But the University of Cincinnati, which is just 30 minutes south of us, requires a bachelor's degree, will pay more money, and give you a 40% work from home on day one. But like it's amazing. The two jobs are very, very similar, but yet they're able to offer those same things, but for a lesser degree. Right. And I have friends that have less education than I do that make way more money than I do, and they just have a bachelor's degree. On the flip side of that, we're in the middle of hiring a dean for the college that I work in, and that person needs to have a terminal degree, meaning a PhD, and they're one of the required fields that we oversee, whether it's architecture, music, theater, arts management, and so on. Theater, art, we have, we're the arts, we're a bigger college, but I understand somebody wanting that kind of an experience for that high level of position, but in the church world, it may not be as realistic, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think those are just some. Again, I think those are some key things. And I think the big thing, and I liked how my friend did this, that when you do, even if you're having a trial with somebody in a position, don't necessarily proclaim that this is the person. Because I think that was a wise move, because let's face it, like a lot of times people are want to know everybody else's business. So the fact that you say, hey, here's our new secretary, Scott Stedman, new secretary of this church, and I work one day and I quit, what happened to Scott? And all of a sudden you now have
backlash.
Not necessarily backlash, but now you're just filled with a whole bunch of questions, especially if you're trying to keep things professional. And I think there's a fine line between being professional and kind of feeding the crowd with gossip. So if it's like, oh, well, I think even sometimes, we see this like in other people where they've handled like people leaving the church or people firing, how they've managed it poorly, because instead of being professional, like the WWE, anytime when they've had to lay off people, especially around the pandemic, the WWE has laid off this WWE superstar. We wish them the best in their future endeavors.
You mean being transparent and having a conversation?
Yeah.
Similar to what we were talking about earlier when we started.
Yeah. But even like with the WWE, it's a business, it's a profession, and they're not going to get into details. Well, occasionally, they would say things like, well, the reason why we're laying people off is because of financial issues. Or we laid this person off because they just violated company's drug policy. There could be some eternal memos of why that's happening, but as far as what's being communicated to the public, this person's no longer with our company. We wish them the best in wherever they go. I mean, from the WWE side, we're not hearing much about like Drew McIntyre's contract status, but you do hear a bunch of it from different like sports bloggers, sports wrestling bloggers, and sometimes you don't know if what they're saying is actually legit or if it's just, well, since we don't officially know, we're just going to kind of make something up because that's going to get us more hits and more follows, and it's going to help our business. So I think within the church, if you're very clear of not saying, okay, this is our person, and then it doesn't work out, and then you have to answer the questions, just wait. And if that person says, you know what, I don't think this is a good fit for me, and you kind of walk away, that's fine. And then that way, the other people that you do have that's still in your back pocket say, hey, we reviewed your resume. We think you might be a good fit. Are you able to come in and start working this week? And you can go to your list of donors instead of, okay, now we have to do this whole dog pony. We have to go through this whole grueling, stressful process of hiring someone for this position. We hired someone. We said, this is the person. We told everyone else we're not hiring you. And then that person left after one day. And now you have to go back and beg the people, hey, can you come work for us? Because I know, at least for a pastor, when I've had times where I didn't get the position after, 2 or 3 interviews, or maybe I candidated and maybe they had and I know that they had like other couple people candidating too the next couple weeks. And I find out, hey, you're not the person. And then later on, a month later, you get that phone call and saying, oh, by the way, are you still interested in the position? And it's like, at that point, no, I'm not. Because again, you just told me I didn't get it. And you probably told me because you didn't like my preaching, or you thought I was too young or too old or uneducated or too educated. And now you're coming back and calling me and saying, we want you after you insulted me. Like, no. I'm not coming back there. Because already just that conversation when you told me that I was no longer going to be considered for a position and the way it was handled, told me everything about the culture. Not only told me about you as someone who I'm going to have to do ministry with in a higher leadership level, but it's also probably going to reflect the culture of that congregation as well, which fair or unfair bias, but it rubs me the wrong way. So I'm no longer going to consider being your pastor or your secretary or whatnot. So that's my final thought on church staffing and the do's and don'ts of church staffing. Do be Christ-like. Do be Christ-like in your personality, in your care, in your communication, but within your procedures, try to be more business-like, I guess, in some ways, and be very professional in how you do it.
Yeah. Those are 2 words that you don't hear a lot in church. Be professional.
Oh no, absolutely not. And I think that's something like my dad being someone who works in a business and professional. That's one thing I think when he started getting into church leadership, that was one thing he had to really navigate to make sure that there was a discipline with hiring people and doing it in a very respectful, Christ-like way, but also doing it in a very professional way. Because that's the thing. I think if you're looking for a position, I want to know, by you being professional, it's going to already give me the illusion or the knowledge that this is going to be a very well-ran organization based on the professionalism that I experience in the interviewing process. If the communication seems off, if the way the hiring thing seems off, if there's something that seems off, then I'm going to say, well, if everything seems to be off, then it probably means that this organization is not very professional, or it's very chaotic, and where there's probably going to be a lot of lack of communication, a lot of fumbling that's going to happen. Or sometimes it seems like on Sunday morning, instead of having a good laid out plan of what we're going to do, in a very polished plan, it's going to be like, okay, we're just going to kind of wing it Sunday. And it's like, well, if that's the culture, then maybe that's not the culture I need to be a part of. Maybe because I don't do well with fly off the seat of my pants, or maybe I'm someone who thrives well in a very polished, like contained environment that people know what they're doing, and that's how I excel. And so I'm not trying to figure out or do a lot of guesswork with everything.
Mm-hmm.
So, and with that, my friends, that is the end of our podcast. Thank you so much for listening. I don't know if you're someone who maybe, hopefully this helps you with figuring out, or maybe rewriting your whole hiring process when it comes to not only church staff, but maybe even with your lead pastor. So friends, thank you so much for listening, and we'll be back on with another episode, which I guess depending on how Friday goes, we'll probably be talking more about the Church of God responses to Church of God Affirm, or we may not be talking about it because maybe it just may be too much of a sticky or hurtful, or maybe even just a very uncomfortable topic that Mike and I are like, you know what? I don't think we need to talk about this, because not because we don't want to, but because it's probably going to be a very, very emotionally charged podcast. So we'll play it by ear. We'll see what happens. But would you say that's fair?
I'm ready.
Oh, you're ready? You want to have it? All right. Well, friends, just negate everything I just said that last second. But all right. Well, I guess we'll be back on, and we will talk about kind of what's going to happen Friday with that live stream. So again, if you're a Church of God minister, 1 to 2 Facebook Live, Church of God Ministries, Anderson, Indiana, Facebook page. Jim Lines, the general director, is going to speak on that topic. So, and hopefully give some clarity or give some more understanding about where we are as a movement and how we should approach that topic. So I'm Scott. You guys have a wonderful rest of your weekend, and we'll be back with a new episode. Take care.